So I want to quickly talk about some examples because it might help. So, setting aside the fact that they're fictional, we can think about characters like Clark Kent and Superman. Clark Kent, we might say the sense is something like the mild-mannered reporter who works at the Daily Planet, who's friends with Jimmy Olsen. Again, you kind of build in a bunch of things into this sense, into the description. Contrast that with Superman, right? He's the man who can run faster than a speeding bullet, leap tall buildings in a single bound, etc., 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 etc. And you build stuff into the description. That is, it's part of the mode of presentation. Now, of course, what you might learn is that though they have different modes of presentation, they're both for the same guy. The same thing with learning that Kal-El is Clark Kent, is Superman. Again, in each one of these, what we have is a different description that's being satisfied by, as it happens, the very same individual. The last son of Krypton. Cool. Different mode of presentation for the very same object. The same thing with Batman and Bruce Wayne, right? The Dark Knight, the Wrath of Gotham, etc., etc., versus the billionaire playboy who seems to never do anything. Different modes of presentation for the same guy. Put bad ears on him, make it different for Superman, right? Again, we get the same idea. There's different descriptions we might associate with the terms. Different descriptions that encode the presentation. And then we find out what thing it is that satisfies the presentation. What's being presented. Last example. These three. Different mathematical modes of presentation, or actually better, different mathematical terms, all picking out the same thing. They pick out the same value, the same number. They just do it in different ways. One of them just flat out writes it. One of them lists it as a product of 25. And one of them lists it as a cube. 5 times 5 times 5. They all pick out the same number, but they do it in different ways. There's different presentations for the very same thing. So the thought is, right, there's nothing about the thing picked out, because it's the same thing picked out every time. And there's nothing about the particular marks of chalk on the board here that are special. It's something like these marks of chalk express a particular mode of presentation that gets us to the very same number in 3 different ways. That's the kind of thought Frege had. That's the idea behind the notion of sense. So before we talk a little bit more about the nature of senses, I want to just ask, what questions do you have for me on this? We kind of get a grip on this. Again, modes of presentation. So we'll talk more about the details about sense just now. As soon as this thing boots back up. Because it did not want to do just blanking. So we had to go like this. Okay. All right. So, thinking about the nature of senses. So senses are, or capture, or express modes of presentation. They basically give you a rule for finding the referent, if the thing has one. Other cool thing about senses, they're public. They're shared. Everyone can access them or grasp them. This is the difference between a sense and an idea. Remember, ideas are essentially subjective. Senses are somehow supposed to be out there. What else can we say about them? They are linguistic meanings. When we ask for the meaning of a term, according to Frege, we're asking, what is its sense? What's the mode of presentation it encodes? So the thought is that competent speakers of a language, or competent speakers at least with particular words, grasp the sense of the word, even if they do so implicitly. So you might not be able to spell out what the sense is, but if you really understand and can use the word properly, you've got the sense already. You just don't quite know how to express it. There might be an interesting irony there, which we'll talk about in a moment, as to what kind of terms we might use to talk about senses themselves. Come back to that. Here's the other kind of fun thing. Senses, because of the kinds of things that they do, or are never ambiguous. They're always strict. They always get it to one thing, even though words might be ambiguous. What would it mean for a word to be ambiguous on this picture? I mean, usually, right, we say a word is ambiguous if it has multiple meanings, right? If there's multiple ways to understand what the word says. So on this picture, what would that look like? It'd have lots of senses. Take the word bank. Bank has at least two senses. The thing by the riverside and the financial institution. You can also think of other ones, maybe where you turn. Right? Different senses, one word. Words can be associated with multiple senses. But importantly, if a word is meaningful and unambiguous, it's got one and only one sense. But individual words can be associated with multiple senses, like bank. So far, so good? Some other fun things about senses. You've said this already, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it. Yeah?
So sense and language are necessarily...
Yeah, good. So here's the other cool thing, though, according to Frege. Senses don't require language. That is, they could exist even if the language wouldn't. They're abstract objects, according to Frege. Unfortunately, he said they exist in the third realm, which in German is not a very happy thing to say. But what he really meant was they're not part of the kind of kickable physical reality, and they're not part of subjective ideas. They're abstracta. Okay. So they could exist even if language didn't, but language could not be meaningful if there were no senses. So senses determine referent. One upshot of this is that if two expressions have the same sense, they of course have the same referent. If they have the same mode of presentation, then they must pick out the same thing, if they pick out anything at all. The other way doesn't go. Reference doesn't determine sense. Two expressions can have the same referent despite having different senses. Again, just think of Clark Kent and Superman. Just think of our different ways to write the same number. Just think about Jocasta as the wife versus the mother. Same referent, different senses. Notably, nothing said so far guarantees that a sense means a referent. You can have a sense without having a referent. What would be an example? So Frege talks about a couple in the paper. Can we think of any examples?
Maybe Santa Claus.
Santa Claus would be a good one, right? It's got a sense. There's a mode of presentation. But unfortunately, don't mean to crush people's dreams, there is no Santa, no referent there. Arguably, Oedipus and Jocasta also, if we take them to be fictional names, have senses but no reference. The same thing with Clark Kent and Superman and Bruce Wayne and Batman. here's something nice. You already can sort of probably see how this is going to help us solve one of our problems. We can make sense of expressions even if they don't have references. They have meaning despite not having reference. And finally, you obviously cannot have reference without sense, because sense determines reference, so there's no getting to something without via a mode of presentation. Okay. Yes?
Can you explain the first one again?
Yeah, good. So the important thought is that the mode of presentation, the sense, picks out what object we're talking about. So let's take Clark Kent as an example. So this term has a sense, the mild-mannered reporter who works at the Daily Planet, say. Because of that mode of presentation, we know what it picks out. That's it. If there is somebody who's like that. In this case, we know why it doesn't pick out anybody. There is no Daily Planet, there's no mild-mannered reporter like that, etc., etc., etc. The tallest person in the room. That has a pretty blatant sense. It wears its mode of presentation on its sleeve, as it were. And then we could go find out who that is. We measure people's heights and find out who's the tallest. The mode of presentation gets us to the thing we want to talk about.
The other two expressions, are they Clark Kent and Superman?
Good. Do these two have the same sense?
No.
Ah, that's fine. But I said if two expressions have the same sense, they must have the same referent.
I think I get it.
So it would be like the wife of Oedipus and the wife of Oedipus. I hope to God those pick out the same thing. It's very hard to even come up with an example where we have two words with the very same sense. Because as soon as you have two words, it feels like you already can have a difference. Hold that thought, though. We'll come back to it. So, okay. So far, so good with senses. Note, everything we've said so far has basically been talking about senses for something like singular terms. Names, definite descriptions. You might wonder about things like predicates. So according to Frege, this sense of a predicate is what he calls a concept. Now note, again, concept here sounds very idealistic. It sounds like it's something in your head. That's just unfortunate choice of terminology on Frege's part. A better way to think about it is, it's something like a set. And then the reference of a predicate is the extension, what the concept applies to. This is something I think Miguel will talk a little bit more to you about, but according to Frege, concepts are what he calls unsaturated. What this really means is that in order to kind of exist or to be, they have to have objects that instantiate them. It doesn't really make sense to ask about the meaning of a concept or the sense of a concept on its own. You can only really talk about it in terms of a sentence. So it doesn't really make sense to ask about the meaning of is a horse. You can ask about what's the meaning of is a horse in the sentence, Bucephalus is a horse, or red rum is a horse. Note, this kind of brings us back to some stuff we talked about near the top. Again, words aren't going to have meanings on their own. Predicates aren't going to have meanings on their own. They make sense in the context of sentences. Okay, so cool. We talked about it for singular terms. We just talked about it for predicates. Here's the very cool thing. Sentences, whole sentences, also have something like senses. Sentences have senses of a sort. God, so many S's. So according to Frege, the sense of a sentence is what we can call a thought. Again, some very unhelpful choice of terminology on Frege's part. He says, by a thought, I understand not the subjective performance of thinking, but its objective content, which is capable of being the common property of several thinkers. So another way to put this is, a Phrygian thought is whatever it is we all have when we think the same thought. Clark Kent is Superman. If we all think that, whatever it is that we're all sharing, that we're all grasping, that's the Phrygian thought, not the particular kind of thing that's going on inside each one of our heads. So much like senses, Phrygian thoughts are objective, they're publicly graspable, we can share them. Now thoughts are composite objects. They have parts. And they're made up of the senses of their constituent expressions. So basically, to kind of go back to that Phrygian logical picture, a thought is going to basically be the sense of the subject term and the sense of the predicate term, possibly more complex things if it's a more complex sentence. So there's a thought that's expressed by Alfred is tall. And this Phrygian thought is composed of the sense of Alfred and the sense of is tall put together in the right way. There's a thought that Nathan is tired. Sense of Nathan, sense of is tired, put together in the right way. That gives us the thought that we can all share. Cool. But of course, that's just part of the picture. So sentences express thoughts, but what's their reference? What do they refer to? What do we think? Do we remember what Frege says? I'll take that as a no. So Frege has a very interesting view here. Frege says, the reference of a sentence may always be sought whenever the reference of its components are involved. But this is the case when, and only when, we're inquiring after the truth value. We're therefore driven into accepting the truth value of a sentence as its referent. Every declarative sentence concerned with the referent of its words is therefore to be regarded as a proper name, and its referent, if it exists, is either the true or the false. So, weird. Let's unpack. According to Frege, the referent of a declarative sentence is a truth value, and there's only two. There's the true, and there's the false. Sentences are basically just like really big names, and they're really big names for truth values. So Alfred is tall and Nathan is tired, if both true, are just different names for the true. It's a very weird kind of view. But no, we can still explain why we might learn things. If it's all names for the true, cool. They all express different thoughts. They're different modes of presentation of the true. It's a wonderful little coherent synthesis. Okay. So before we turn to the problems, solving the puzzles, to pause and quickly ask, how are we feeling? Are we kind of getting the grip on the Phrygian picture? Basically, that triangle is the big thing. Every term is going to express a sense, and that sense is going to determine a reference. And if there's something that satisfies a mode of presentation, you get the denotation out. It refers. And that same fucking picture works for sentences too. Sentences express thoughts, which are composed of the senses of the words, determines whether it picks up the true or the false, and if it's true, it picks up the true. If it's false, it picks up the false. It's a wonderful system. All you have to do is believe in senses and think they do all of this heavy lifting. Cool. So let's put the machinery to work. Let's solve our problems. So we're going to go with this in a kind of weird order. I'm going to start here and go around this way. We'll go clockwise, starting in the bottom left. So remember our puzzles. How to make sense of the parent reference to non-existence, how to make sense of negative existentials, how to make sense of informative identity statements, and what to do about apparent failures of substitution. We'll start with this one because it's easy. That was the whole motivation for introducing senses. So let's talk about Frege's puzzle. Here's an identity statement. Calvin Cortazar Brodish Jr. is the same person as himself. Does anyone know who this is? Nobody?
Is it beautiful?
No, you're in the right ballpark.
Yeah.
No. Older. Okay.
Oh man.
Snoop Dogg. Cool. Everybody learned something again. You didn't go home unhappy. So how could we learn something here? Easy. Different modes of presentation. Right? This has a very different mode of presentation than this. That is, the difference in cognitive value between the two identity statements can be explained by the difference in sense of the two names. These ones, the top one, has the same sense on both sides, so no wonder it's a priori and analytic. This one, while it's got the same referent, it's got different senses. This is telling us there's multiple modes of presentation that get us to the same object. We learn that different senses get us to the same referent. Different terms get us to the same referent via the modes of presentation they express. Cool. Unsurprising he's got a good story to tell here. Again, that was the whole beginning argument. Remember the thing we went through, the opening paragraph? All right. What is he going to say about apparent reference to non-existence? So in the puzzle example, I had Holmes as a detective. Frege, because he likes to be difficult, uses a slightly longer sentence. He uses the sentence, Odysseus was set ashore at Ithaca while sound asleep, showing off his classical education. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus, in fact, is knocked out, deposited on the shores of Ithaca. Wonderful. What will we say about this sentence? How can we even make sense of it? Well, here's Frege's trick. Odysseus is a singular term. It's a name. And it's a meaningful name. That is, it has a sense, a mode of presentation. But of course, nothing satisfies the mode of presentation. There's nothing referred to or denoted. The term has a sense, but no referent. But it has a sense. And the sense is all we need for meaning. This sentence, Odysseus was set ashore at Ithaca while sound asleep, involves a bunch of expressions, all of which have senses. That means there's a thought expressed here, composed of the sense of Odysseus, of being set ashore, of being at Ithaca, of being sound asleep. The sentence expresses a thought. That is, the composite sense made up of all the senses of the parts. But it doesn't have a referent, according to Frege. And it doesn't have a referent because that term, Odysseus, doesn't have a referent. It fails to pick out somebody, so the thought fails to pick out anything. It does not refer. So one really weird upshot there. Remember, what are the referents of sentences, according to Frege? Remember the two things that sentences could refer to? The true or the false, right? So sentences like this that feature empty names are neither true nor false for Frege. They make sense, they're meaningful, but they don't have a truth value. And note, they don't have a truth value. So it's not that this is false. This is neither true nor false. The same thing with Holmes as a detective. Or the other one I like to talk about, the dude abides. Right? Unfortunately, the dude isn't real. So the dude abides is neither true nor false. It's just meaningful, but neither true nor false. And remember, that addresses the puzzle, because the puzzle was, how do we make sense of this talk? Now, we might not find it satisfying, because you might think, no, I still wanted something like truth to come through. It feels like Holmes as a detective is true. Frege's not going to give you that. So sentences about, or purportedly about, non-existent objects with empty terms lack truth values. But we can make sense of them. They're meaningful. Cool. So 2 out of the 3 addressed. How about our third one? Negative existentials. This gets weird. As if what we talked about isn't weird enough. So Odysseus doesn't exist. How would Frege make sense of this? Well, he doesn't explicitly talk about this in On Sense and Reference. But there are a few ways that we can kind of extend what he said so far. So here's one. Oh, and I should stress, to go back a second, he does talk about this. So he talks about what to do with Odysseus and things like this. This is, I think, maybe 5 or 6 pages into the paper. He talks about this very sentence and how to understand it. But Odysseus doesn't exist. Well, how can we treat this? Well, here's one option. Look, we said that sentences featuring empty names are neither true nor false, so maybe this sentence isn't true or false. It's just kind of, it's like Holmes as the detective. That's a weird way to go, though, because it looks like this needs to come out true, right? In fact, the reason why we want to say that Holmes, the detective, isn't true or false is because Holmes doesn't exist. So we want this to come out true, or something like it. That doesn't seem so good. Here's another way to go. Maybe this is just a roundabout way to say the name Odysseus has a sense but no referent. So when I say Odysseus doesn't exist, it's actually just a very subtle way for me to talk about language. It's got an implicit use mention slide. And this maybe makes sense, but it feels like this, Odysseus has a sense but no reference, is a very different mode of presentation than this. They seem to express different thoughts. So this doesn't seem like quite right either. Here's the way Frege goes. And this is in a different paper, which we'll talk a little bit about in 8 weeks' time. Frege says, well, to understand a claim like this, you have to introduce something like a property of being Odysseus, being identical to Odysseus. And to say this is to say that concept, that property, isn't satisfied. So it's a weird way to say, cool, if I look out and count the Odysseuses, I find none. One thing that might be ringing alarm bells is it looks like to say this, we have to know who this motherfucker is. In other words, we would need to make sense of Odysseus in order to make sense of him not existing, but then we're into a lovely feedback. To be honest, though, this wasn't a problem that Frege really worried about. And in fact, the same is true, to go back a slide, with this apparent reference to non-existence. He thought that both of these are byproducts of how shitty natural language is. Basically, he really wanted everything to be a perfect formal language. As he says on page 222, a logically complete language should satisfy the conditions that every expression grammatically well constructed is a proper name, signs already introduced, in fact designates an object, and that no new sign will be introduced as a proper name without having a referent assured. Put in slightly less fancy language, a logically complete language would have one term for every object, and for every object there would be one term. There would be no extras. We would never talk about non-existent objects because we wouldn't need to. That's unnecessary. So he wasn't too concerned with these puzzles, these two, the ones we just talked about in this negative existential, because his grand hope was we could eliminate all of this talk. Unclear if it was a good idea. And here's the last one, substitution. So we can put it this way, talking about my friend Tim. So Tim believes that Dylan is a singer. That looks true. Tim believes that Zimmerman is a singer. That looks false. But of course, Dylan is Zimmerman. So how do we make sense here? Here's Frege's insight, another wonderful, amazing insight. So, okay, note in these cases, what we have is a subordinate clause. That is, the whole sentence involves another sentence inside it. Dylan is a singer. Zimmerman is a singer. Those are already sentences. So what's happening? In those cases, the embedded sentences, they don't have their usual reference. Instead of getting us to the true or the false, they do something different. If they're in these cases, inside something like a believes that, or hopes that, or wishes that, instead of taking us to the true and the false, their reference is their usual sense. So instead of referring to truth values, they pick out their thoughts. Which makes sense. Because what is it that Tim believes? Tim believes the thing that's meaningfully expressed by Dylan as a singer. What does Tim not believe? He doesn't believe the thing meaningfully expressed by Zimmerman as a singer. It's a different thought. So in these kinds of cases, when they're subordinate clauses, in this sort of way, sentences denote thoughts rather than the truth values. It's a wonderful move. And it makes sense if we think of thoughts, as the sorts of things that we're picking out whenever we're contemplating or judging or holding the relevant sentence. It's a wonderful system. And all we have to do is have this notion of sense, allow for thoughts, which are built up out of senses, and this last little trick of when they're in subordinate clauses, they denote their own senses. Okay. Nice! So we got about 7 minutes, give or take. Before going on, we just ask, yes?
How does that work with thoughts being objective? Is it both Dylan is a singer and Zimmerman is a singer? It's something that's objective. Wouldn't that also make it true?
Good. So here's the trick, right? Is what it is that we're standing in this belief relation to, according to Frege, is going to be this object in the third realm. Again, bad name. Right? This abstract object. The mode of presentation of the true that's picked out by the combination of senses of Zimmerman and his assailant. Or the mode of presentation that's picked out by the combination of Dylan and his assailant. So Tim stands in the believe relation to one, who does not stand in the believe relation to another. Both of them can be out there. He just doesn't believe one. He does the other. Even though, as it happens, they both denote the truth. Just like how Lois might believe that Clark is a reporter and not believe that Superman is a reporter. What explains the difference? The mode of presentation of those two terms. They have different senses, so the embedded sentences express different thoughts, even though it's the same dude in both cases, who is in fact a reporter and a superhero. Another way to put the answer is, the subjectivity comes in about the believes relation. It matters who this is. But what they're standing to, anybody could. Before the last little bit, other questions? So don't stress too much. I've thrown a lot of stuff at you because Frege's picture is weird and wonderful and kind of big, but I wanted to basically just run through all of it. Miguel will talk to you about some of the relevant associated ideas. We'll talk more about some of them again next week because Russell basically, he really liked this picture, but also thought it didn't work. And I want to quickly talk about why Russell thought it didn't work. So we'll talk about a few quick problems. We'll talk more about them next week, but I just want to float them at you. Here's the first one. So this is actually the first proper footnote in the article. This is footnote 2. It's worth reading and thinking about what it says. Basically, the problem is, it looks like people could disagree about what mode of presentation an individual term has. And that's a problem. Because then it looks like we could have Aristotle is Aristotle be informative. Because I might not know Aristotle was born in Stagria. Or it might be analytic if I think that his being from Stagria is part of the very mode of presentation of his name. So what we build into the description can be different. That's a problem. Because they're supposed to be shared in public. And it seems like we can disagree about the shared in public aspects. Shit. We've got a problem. So it's hard to extend this story perfectly to the way we actually use names. One we'll talk about a little bit in next week or the week after. Here's another problem. The truth value gaps thing looks bad. So, take the present King of France is bald. Is that true or false? Well, there ain't no present King of France, right? Well, what about it's not the case that the present King of France is bald? That kind of feels to me like it should be true, right? Because that says it's not the case that he's a balding. But the problem is, right, if Frege is right, this shouldn't be true either. This should be neither true nor false. Don't like that. It starts to be really gappy. The world starts to have a lot of places where truth value gaps crop up. Some of them might be problematic or worrisome. Russell really doesn't like this. His big push is going to be to avoid this kind of problem. Okay. Here's probably the worst problem for Frege. And this is called Mates's puzzle. It's about ketchup and catsup. Basically, Americans ruin everything. That's one of the lessons here. So here's something really weird. Ketchup and catsup are synonyms. Let me stress that. They're synonyms. What does it mean to say two things are synonyms? They mean the same thing. That means they have the same sense. Because remember, senses are what meanings are. Cool, here's a problem. No one doubts that whoever believes something is ketchup believes that that thing is ketchup. But it seems very sensible to doubt that whoever believes that something is ketchup is also catsup. That is, these have the same sense, but it looks like you can disagree about application. That's very bad. Because now it looks like we can gain cognitive significance even if both sides have the same sense. Do we see the puzzle there? I'm getting some puzzle books. We'll reinforce it. If I tell you that the thing inside the bottle is ketchup and the thing inside the bottle is catsup, if they really do have the same sense, I just said the same sentence twice. I've expressed the same thought both times. But if I've expressed the same thought, then there's no way for you to believe one and not the other. Because that's what senses were supposed to do. They were supposed to get us to explain why you could have this difference. But if they have the same sense, then there's nothing to do the explaining anymore. Senses can't do their job, it looks like. Or something else needs to get in, explain what's going on with the cognitive value that we gain from learning ketchup and catsup are the same thing. That's a problem. So we'll talk more about this again next week. It's a very weird, funny problem for Frege. Really unclear how he can get out of it. So cool. Oh, that's totally wrong. Anyway, looks like I put the wrong slide again. So what we're going to do next week is we're going to basically build off a bunch of these problems. We'll talk more about them at the very beginning of next lecture. And we're going to turn to Russell's approach to philosophy of language. So Russell really liked some of the moves that Frege was making. In particular, he thought that the kind of idea that the pure relations between names, that's not going to work. Pure relations between reference, that's not going to work. Something like this mode of presentation move was a good idea. But the appeal to senses, not so much. So Russell's trick is going to be to try and force everything into something like logical structure. Every name, or almost every name for Russell, is going to be a definite description. Just like we were kind of talking about. But it's going to be baked into the term. Not going to have to buy into anything like senses. And hopefully we can then solve some of the problems, solve our puzzles, and avoid the issues with Frege. So that's what we'll talk about next week. Note there's 3 readings. 2 of them are really short. So try and plow through all 3 of them beforehand, and we'll talk about it. Thanks guys for coming. Have a lovely week, and we'll see you all next Tuesday.